Ultra healthy video game nerd back in action. I know in a lot of my videos I usually cover action platformers and shooters, and some people may be wondering, do I ever play turn-based RPGs? Well, the answer is yes. Of course I play RPGs. Role-playing games are a big part of my gaming experience. In fact, one of the first games I ever owned was Dragon Warrior 1 for the NES. It was probably the fourth or fifth game I bought for the system. At first, I had no idea how to play it. I would just walk straight out of the town, go into battles, and just get my ass kicked. I couldn't do any damage. I remember one time we went to visit a friend of the family, and they had a son who had chicken pox at the time. Thankfully, I had already had them, so I was the only person who could go and hang out with him. And I can't remember if I had brought the game or if he owned it also, but we started talking about it and I was saying, I just don't know how to play this game, and he was like, oh yeah, you have to go into the shops, buy weapons and armor, and then go out and fight the enemies. And I was just like, what? I had never even thought of such a thing. So after I did that, it was over. I was totally into role-playing games, played the hell out of that, and shortly after I bought Final Fantasy 1, and God only knows how many hours I put into that game. So it's a huge part of my gaming experience. And living through the 16-bit era also, of course, Final Fantasy 4 and 6 are just fundamental to my being. They're two of the most enjoyable things I've ever experienced in life, gaming or otherwise. And they're such an integral part of my being that I could probably go back at any time, any point in my life. If someone says, you have to play this game through right now, I will be in utter bliss. It's just the way it goes. As influential as Final Fantasy 4 and 6 were on me, there is one role-playing game that I like even more than those. Well, maybe it's not accurate to say that I like it more, but I like it on a different, more primal, childlike level. That game is Final Fantasy Legend for the original Game Boy. And today, I'd like to talk about why. First of all, Final Fantasy Legend isn't a Final Fantasy game. RPGs didn't have a big market in the West at that time, and instead of trying to introduce a brand new series, Square altered the name so that it could be recognized by people who knew their other game that was already somewhat successful, Final Fantasy. But in Japan, the game we know as Final Fantasy Legend was called Makai Toshi Saga. It was the first game in a completely new series that would span 3 games on the original black and white Game Boy, before morphing into the romancing Saga games on the SNES, and then Saga Frontier on the PlayStation. Final Fantasy Legend is a turn-based RPG that allows you to create a party of 4 by choosing from a set of characters with different attributes in the very beginning of the game. But the similarities to Final Fantasy end there. There are 3 types of character you can choose from: human, mutant, and monster. The humans start out with relatively high physical strength and hit points, making them the most valuable in the beginning of the game. Mutants aren't as strong as humans, but develop magic spells and other special abilities basically at random as you defeat enemies. The mutants were the beginning of the type of character development that came to be symbolic of the Saga series, gaining stats and abilities gradually depending on what you do in battle, instead of a straightforward experience-based leveling up system. Monsters, the third type of character, are the same monsters that you fight in the game. They come with the same preset attacks and abilities that the actual enemies have. A monster in your party will never level up or develop, but you can eat meat dropped from enemies that you've defeated in order to change into another, hopefully stronger monster. As an elementary school student, having that much variety in character types was a pretty big jump in gameplay for me. But there are even more differences between Final Fantasy Legend and other RPGs of the time like Dragon Warrior or Final Fantasy that make it a revolutionary game. First of all, weapons can't be used infinitely. When you buy a weapon in Final Fantasy Legend, it comes with a number next to it, which is the number of times you can attack with the weapon before it breaks. Most swords can be used 50 times, but some stronger weapons can only be used 20 times or less, and even if you miss, it still counts as a use. Mindless grinding in this game isn't anywhere near as profitable as it is in the early Final Fantasy games. And yes, they've priced the weapons high enough such that you really have to think your purchases through. Thankfully, armor is permanent. Also, your characters don't level up in this game, including humans. Mutants will gradually see their max hit points go up as the game sees fit, but in order to increase a human's max HP, you need to buy an HP up item. And again, they're expensive enough such that you won't be able to just raise your character's HP up so high that you'll be invincible. When I was a kid, I didn't think about things in such an analytic way, but I can now see just how much thought and talent it would have taken to make a game with this kind of balance. It's very unlikely that you'll ever have enough money to just buy everything you want. You really have to choose carefully between weapons, armor, and life-increasing items. And since your weapons get used up as you battle enemies, just grinding won't increase your fortunes indefinitely. Considering this was their first attempt to making a game with this kind of system, that's just all the much more impressive. So what about the actual game world itself? RPGs are often judged by their stories or the sense of adventure that they give the player with their overall presentation. The good news is, Final Fantasy Legend is not lacking in either of these categories. The game revolves around a mysterious tower that supposedly leads to paradise. Apparently your characters are tempted by the bohemian lifestyle as they set out to conquer the tower. The world is separated into several subworlds that you discover as you defeat bosses and progress further up the tower. There's an ocean world, a sky world, even a futuristic world. So again, it differs from other RPGs of the time in that the game isn't set on one big planet. Instead, you progress through worlds, almost like levels in other game genres. The story itself is actually pretty sparse. You're encouraged along the way by a mysterious character who calls himself the Creator, an idea not uncommon to Japanese games and anime. I like the fact that the story isn't too detailed because A, it doesn't bog the game down in text, and B, it gives it a more abstract, mysterious feel. I've mentioned in my other videos that I don't really like it when games are too heavy on story and try to mimic the experience of going to a movie. Just give me some idea of what's going on and just let my imagination fill in the rest. Which I feel leads perfectly into why I call Final Fantasy Legend my favorite RPG. It's a combination of randomness and character growth and the not perfectly clear story that make Final Fantasy Legend an ethereal experience. Your mutant characters will just suddenly have a really powerful magic spell after one battle, and just as suddenly lose it a half hour or an hour later. It almost makes the game feel like an organic living being as it evolves your characters at random. It can be hard to get your monsters to turn into something as useful as the rest of your party, but when it does happen, you really feel like you're at an advantage. Being developed by Square, the dungeons are just challenging enough, but not so much that you lose heart. There are also tons of unique weapons, not only swords but guns like muskets and even bazookas, all with their strengths and disadvantages. And lots of them can only be found by following some obscure path in a dungeon that seems like it leads to nowhere otherwise. To this day, it still blows my mind how much there is to do in this tiny little cartridge made for a black and white handheld game system. In fact, Final Fantasy Legend was the very first RPG for the Game Boy. I couldn't talk about Final Fantasy Legend without mentioning the soundtrack. It was done by Nobuo Uematsu, as you would expect from an early Square game, and I dare say the music may be as good and as memorable as the first Final Fantasy. Now that's a big claim, but I swear, the melancholy melodies in Final Fantasy Legend will haunt you forever and also keep your determination up in those unforgiving dungeons. From the towns to the battles to the overworlds, Uematsu turns the Game Boy sound chip into a cosmic symphony. It's a huge part of the experience. Final Fantasy Legend is one of those games where I can just power it up and I'm in bliss. I just love to be inside of its universe. Is some of that nostalgia? Probably. But if nostalgia is a longing for a past experience, then anybody can have a nostalgic feeling with this game by playing it today. Thanks a lot for sticking around to the end of the video. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe. There's a lot more fun retro gaming stuff coming up. See you next time.